Why a goblin? 211. He's Awake, Book 4. Rick had left to go on his journey deeper in the dark land of Mir long before the GES forces had gathered in the camp. Long before they had formed ranks and stormed into the forest for the first time to begin their attack against the goblins. Rick was fighting Tier 7 creatures. Long before the first of his 14 chiefs had to pay a price with his life, Rick was working on getting stronger. Long before Chief Hugala had to fight with her soul on the line, Rick was doing what a king needed to do. So it was no surprise that only a couple days, and likewise a couple battles, after Chief Hugala fought with her literal soul on the line, something shifted within the mana around them. It was subtle at first, not noticeable unless you were present next to the source, but eventually it grew and grew and grew. So much that even if they wanted to ignore what they were sensing, the Tier 7s on both the sides of the goblins and the sides of the GES force could feel the weight of mana that clung and gripped the air around them, pulling it towards a singular point. Of course, this point was located on the borders of goblin lands, just beyond the front. This was the location where a very special goblin was going through a very special evolution. Now, while Tier 7 and below couldn't quite compare with Tier 8 and above, Tier 6 and below still couldn't quite compare with Tier 7, especially not the Tier 7 of a goblin king. Not just a royal goblin, but the actual king of all goblins. A being who is naturally supposed to be above others, to have lessers, to look at his people and know that not a single one of them was his better, to look down upon those who will kneel before him. Their Tier 7 evolution could not and would not be the same as others. So when the world sensed that an evolution had been triggered for the Goblin King to reach the 7th tier, a tier that was once known as the peak of all tiers, well, the world responded. Regardless of who you were, regardless of what you were, the mana that you were so casually commanding would feel just a slight pull on it. You wouldn't lose control of your mana, especially not when it sprang forth from your own body, but the mana that usually responded from outside in the environment now had a different call. One it naturally wanted to follow, one it was inclined to follow. It was within the nature of wild mana to follow the call of the Goblin King. The king needed to evolve, and the world obliged. Mana poured in from all directions and roared to life as it took Rick's body apart, limb by limb, organ by organ, cell by cell, all the way down to his very soul, which was remodeled, reorganized, and rebuilt anew again. The Tier 7 evolution cannot compare to the ones that sat so highly above it. But the Tier 7 evolution of a Goblin King could not compare to anything on or below the same level as itself. And all of them could feel it. They could feel the gravity of the situation. The goblins had experienced something similar on 2 previous occasions. First, when Rick went from being just a royal goblin to instead the king of goblins. Secondly, when Rick evolved from Tier 5 to the 6th. So although they were currently on the battlefield and hadn't had an inkling as to the fact that Rick had returned, that their king had returned, the moment they felt the familiar feeling, they knew. Deep down inside, they knew that what they were feeling and the direction they were feeling it from could only mean one thing. The king was back, and he would soon join them in battle. The humans, on the other hand, did not understand what they were feeling. For humans evolved a bit differently than that of goblins, or those like them. Humans didn't go through such vastly different physical changes when they evolved. All of their evolutions, per se, had far more to do with what was inside of them than their outward appearances. Proven by the fact that they still aged, albeit at a much slower rate the higher tiers they went up, and also by the fact that they all still looked like humans. So this evolutionary feeling that they were experiencing was just a little out of the norm for their senses. Not to say they weren't aware of how goblins and orcs evolved, but most of them had never been around a goblin evolving, let alone one evolving to the 7th tier. To compound on that further, one that was not only evolving to the 7th tier, but a Goblin King evolving to the 7th tier. So it took them more than a few moments to understand what they were experiencing. Of course, it was the spear of Tuval who recognized the situation first and uncharacteristically yelled out to her people, "Push, push, push. We need to move now. Their king is evolving. That is why he hasn't been on the battlefield. He is evolving. We need to push now. Push, push, push." She barked out as her voice boomed over the cacophony of noises that made up all that was war. There is no time to waste. Push now. She continued to push, and just as she was about to finally unleash the abilities she had kept in check since she found no tactical need to expend herself prior to this, an explosion of mana rushed out of a location in the distance, and everyone on the battlefield had to take a pause as the wave on mana hit them. Then, before anyone could react to the sudden wave of mana, a loud boom was heard in the distance, in the same place the mana exploded from. It didn't take a genius to figure out what had just happened. The Goblin King was now awake, and he was coming here, filled with wrath and a taste for vengeance. 212, Arrival, Book 4. After waking up from his evolution, Rick didn't bother looking at his status, nor did he call for his royal guard, nor did he check anything at all about himself for that matter. All he knew was that he was up now. He was here now. And his people needed him. This moment is why he was king. This moment is why he left when his people needed him the most. This was the moment when he would return the faith his people had placed in him. There was nothing else on his mind except vengeance and delivering his wrath to the enemy. And Valora knew this, so she remained quiet. This was not the time to remind Rick of any cons to the situation, of any potential drawbacks to what he was about to do. This was not the moment to be the logic in his actions, to tell him anything that was presumably sensible. Number. That's not what this was. And even if it was that type of moment, she knew Rick would not register a single word she said. So she simply watched. From behind the veil of his eyes and through the shared sense that they possessed, she watched as Rick bent his knees ever so slightly, looked in the direction of the cliff he once stood at that and overlooked the dark lands of Mir, then flexed his muscles, and with one strong push, he leapt across the lands of the clans, covering a vast distance with just one leap. Of course, that one leap wasn't enough to get him from where he was to the foot of the cliff and up and over it, but he got really close. Close enough that it only took a second leap for him to clear the vast height that was the cliff. And the second he rose to the top, his blood boiled. For there he could see the chief of the Shadow Clan fighting off a group of people, wolves and humans alike. But it wasn't the sight of the battle that made his blood boil. Number. It was the fact that the chief was missing an arm. There was nothing beneath the left shoulder of the chief. All that remained there was the blood that hadn't stopped leaking. Rick landed on the cliff with a thud, but his feet barely stayed there for a second before he vanished before the eyes of the shadows of Verdan, his own Shadow Clan chief, and the members of the Black Wolf tribe. The next time he reappeared, there was liquid dripping from his hands, and in them the head of something that resembled a black wolf. The facial expression on the head was still the same one that was there when Rick first arrived. The leader of the Black Wolf tribe didn't even know how it died. The shadows of Verdan reacted quickly, and although suddenly overcome with fear and filled with mourning for their lost comrade, the remaining black members of the Black Wolf tribe reacted just as quickly. But it wasn't quick enough. Rick moved again, vanishing before their very eyes, and everywhere he went, death followed. He was silent. He didn't roar. He didn't rage. He didn't mock his enemies. He didn't stare daggers into their souls. He just moved. He wished death upon those who stood before him, and his body moved to fulfill that wish. Multiple times, so much so that anyone he had yet to kill could no longer stay and fight, but rushed off toward the distant battlefield in retreat. But there would be no reprieve for them. There would be nowhere to run, not while they were still in the dark lands of Mir, not while they were still within reach of the King of Goblins. Rick would have loved to have stayed behind and checked on his chief, but there would be time for that later. For now, at this current point, murder was on his mind, and if the Shadow Clan chief could hear his thoughts, he would spur on his king even more. Rick took off after those who were escaping and eventually found himself on the battlefield. Thousands of goblins, humans, and demi-humans stood in shock. All of them had felt him evolve, and it hadn't been long since he'd woken up. Not long enough for them to immediately begin fighting once more. Even those as experienced as the Spear of Tuval took a bit longer to collect herself. In all her years on the battlefield, in all her years of being alive, in all the books she had read and lectures she had attended, everything she had ever done, there had never been mention of something like what she experienced today. The pull on natural mana that the King of Goblins had, it wanted to be around him. It wanted to assist him in his endeavors. She could feel it. She could feel the untainted and uncontrolled mana in the air gravitating towards the king of goblins ever so slightly. He wasn't sucking all the mana toward him, it wasn't even an aggressive pull. If she even barely willed for the mana to come under her control, it would follow suit. But none of the mana around them moved toward her without her doing anything. None of it clung to her or sought to be near her passively. She had heard of similar things with the elves, and perhaps the archers were just as shocked, if not more so. A creature they saw as a stain, a pest, a monster, something to be eradicated when it suited them. Just one of nature's many mistakes, perhaps, was here. And it was clearly being loved by mana. It was unheard of, unprecedented, something that truly confused the spear of Tuval. Though unfortunately for her, Rick wasn't here to be the subject of their awe and shock. Rick was here for one thing only. Green flames poured out of his body like that of a waterfall. There was nothing they could do to stop it, no dam that could contain it, no wall that could block it. For these flames were powered by wrath, and it was far from being fulfilled. 213. Updated status, Book 4. Not seeing too many options at the moment with the way the battle was going, the humans and demi-humans made what they would remember to be a smart choice. They called for a retreat. They had to grit their teeth and swallow their pride to make such a decision, but it was one they had to make. They still had quite the firepower up their sleeves, and if they were willing to go the extra mile and sacrifice the lives of thousands, they could more than compete in this battle. They'd be able to once again turn the tide and really give Rick and his goblins a run for their money. But they weren't feeling too much in the way of sacrifice today, especially not when most of the lower-tiered soldiers, knights, archers, and everything in between were more than rattled at the moment. In fact, they were actively losing their minds. Rick's green flames had taken hold of the battlefield, and while everything above Tier 6 could resist it, everyone else felt like they were losing a piece of themselves. Not instantly, but slowly enough that it gnawed at their minds, and the thought that you were slowly losing a piece of whoever you were was enough to drive a man insane. That's what was happening, though that wasn't all. Rick's flames empowered his own people while simultaneously making everyone else mad. So while the members of the GES were losing themselves, the goblins of the dark lands of Mir were not only finding themselves, but they were also being empowered, not just in strength, but in morale, which was always going to happen the second they laid eyes on Rick. He was their sun, he was their moon, and with him they rose and they fell. And right now they wanted nothing more than to rally behind him and destroy the enemies who dared to encroach on their soil in an effort to kill him, which was obviously unacceptable. So a retreat was necessary, and this time it was a proper fighting retreat. The goblins, who would have usually tried to break off as early as they could to keep as many of their own alive as possible, were instead on the attack. Green flames still burned brightly around the battlefield, and with the empowered goblins and the slowly maddening humans and demi-humans, they pressed on, cutting a swath out of their enemies before it was all said and done. By the time they reached the point where it was time for them to return and the humans were long out of reach, silence descended on the battlefield for the briefest of seconds before all of the goblins together let out a mighty roar. The king was here. They had waited all this time, and he was finally here. And he did what he promised, not that they ever doubted he would. Not long after the goblins had retreated and the green flames had slowly left the battlefield and receded, a small council session was set up where Rick could meet with his chiefs. Though Rick had his suspicions since he had noticed the situation at the front lines, and even when he made it to the battlefield, what he noticed at a glance didn't sit right with him. Looking around at the state of his chiefs, expecting 14 chiefs to be sitting around him, but instead there were 12. Of course, he did not know where the others were, but before jumping to any conclusions, he asked a simple question. Where are they? It was Chief Roger who spoke up to answer him. Chiefess Hugala is still alive. She is out of commission for the moment, but the chief of the central clan gave his life to protect his fellow goblins, and he did it with a smile. Although Rick wasn't happy to hear that Hugala, whom he had spent a lot of time with during training, was out of commission, he had allowed himself a small bit of hope that the same could be said for Chief Galgo, only for it to be snatched away. All of the chiefs gathered, braced themselves for his reaction, but there was barely any. Rick simply let out a breath, closed his eyes, and remained like that for a few moments. When he opened his eyes again, he took a good look around the room. Although one chief was dead and one was out of commission, the remaining 12 weren't injury-free. In fact, there were quite a few gruesome injuries that he could observe, a missing limb here and there, an eye or two that clearly would no longer work, and who knows how many other things that he couldn't see with the naked eye. Thank you all. I apologize that it has taken so long for me to arrive, but you have done well to hold on for this long. Do not wave me off, Rick said as he looked at his chiefs, trying to stop him from apologizing. At his word, they went silent. I understand, but allow me to do this. When you guys needed it the most, I wasn't here. No. This is not a time for long-winded speeches, so I will stop there and ask you to continue to trust in me. I will maintain the watch until they come back. For now, get some rest, get some medical attention, and make sure the same goes for every goblin in this camp. Not taking no for an answer, Rick then directly left and quite literally went to sit down where the battlefield was. If the humans or demi-humans wanted to attack again, they would have to go through him, and he meant that. In the meantime, there was finally time to take a look at his status. Status: Name, Rick. Age, 23. Race, Goblin King. Tier, 7. Strength, 470 greater than 880. Agility, 290 greater than 580. Dexterity, 295 greater than 610. Intelligence, 170 greater than 310. Endurance, 400 greater than 760. Mana pool, 1,800/1,800 greater than 4,000/4,000. Essence, 0. Evo points, 90,720/90,720 greater than 0/233,280. Skills: Velora, Ruknar, Will of the King, Kaldrez. So what were you saying about my evolution being cut short? 214. Thank you, Book 4. Your evolution was indeed cut short. I am not quite sure how you did it, and I'm still trying to figure that out, but it was cut short. In fact, I expected that you would have had to take a couple of months for this evolution. But my stats. How could I possibly cut my evolution short and still receive this big of an upgrade? Something about that doesn't add up. You're right, it doesn't, and I think the cost you paid to not only have increased in strength this much, while also cutting your evolution short, was what it would require for you to progress to the next tier. Going from just over 90,000 essence to now over 230,000 essence doesn't really feel like a linear increase. That is far more than double what it was previously, and I believe that is the cost you had to pay for what happened. Yeah, I'm not really sure how that works, but at this point in time, I won't complain. Strength in the future is for the future. I needed power now, and I got it. So I'm thankful that I got it. What happens tomorrow, I'll let future Rick deal with it. For now, my people need me, and I am here. I won't have them without their king any longer. That is understandable, but in the future, I advise against doing whatever it is you just did. While your required evolution points to reach the next tier have increased significantly, and I currently think that is the cost you had to pay, it very well might not be. We don't know what else has been affected, and who knows what future costs might appear later. You need power now, yes, but you will also need power in the future. I don't recommend consistently limiting yourself for whatever reason. But understandably, it was needed now. You had a role to play, and you have played it. I'm glad you understand, though I know you weren't sure how this happened, but I'm almost certain you have a few theories. Let's hear your best one. Well, you're not wrong, and again, I am not sure, but I do believe it had something to do with your will. I have reason to believe that you quite literally willed the world to not only accelerate your evolution, but to likely give you the full power of improvements as if you had undergone a full evolution. It is mind-boggling, to say the least, and it bothers me that I cannot figure out a better explanation. But I think that is the best I can come up with at the moment. So I somehow unconsciously asked the world itself to do my bidding, and it agreed. If I wasn't who I currently was, a king of goblins, then I would have thought this idea was impossible and not something I would readily believe. But here I am, the king of goblins, something that is a part of whom I am down to my very soul, and at the very center of all that I am, from my blood to my DNA, I am the king of goblins. Who else but the world or the gods up above, since we know that they are real, could hear my unconscious cry and answer it? Rick then slowly tilted his head toward the sky and spoke in a soft breath. If it was you who heard my cry and allowed me to come to the aid of my people, then thank you. I won't forget it. Of course, nothing responded to the king in the woods. That was all right for Rick, as he spent the rest of the night in silence, just watching and waiting for the reason why anger, pain, and sadness churned in his stomach to show themselves before him. What he showed them earlier was only a small piece of all that he had become. When they returned, he would wait a moment before he called the rest of his people. He needed some time to truly let loose. As for the people in question who brought this upon themselves, they had returned to their camp. Not only was it deathly silent there, with the exception of medical professionals running around and doing their jobs, but the morale had hit its lowest point. Even the Spear of Tuval had just begun to come to terms with the task laid out before her: kill the Goblin King. That was their task. That was their mission. Returning without completing it was unacceptable, which meant they would have to go back and fight that fierce being once again. She was not scared of her opponent, nor was she having second thoughts about taking her spear and meeting her enemies in battle. No, it was the feeling that the King of Goblins gave off that gave her pause. He should have only just reached the 7th tier, and thus should not have been too much of a problem for them, even if she took into account the fact that he was a king and would be stronger than his other companions. Still, things didn't add up the way she thought they should. Because if that was his power, the second his evolution was completed, what would it be then? How would they cope then? They could barely get a grasp on him now. What would it be when everything about his power was fully consolidated? And then there were his flames. Even now she could not understand why she could not get rid of them. Although she wasn't harmed by them and could protect herself from them, that was all she could do. No matter how much mana she poured out, the flames refused to die down, and she could see just how much it affected everyone around her, apart from her fellow Tier 7s. And if that was something he would be able to deploy at the start of the battle and maintain for the entire battle, then they were in for far more than trouble. They would be in for death. All of them. And it wasn't she believing that the king could kill all of them by his lonesome, but that was where the problem became even worse. He wasn't alone. He had an army with him, one that would be able to fight far more freely with him leading them. The Spear of Tuval clenched her fist tightly as she considered all the implications of what was to come. 215. No Other Way, Book 4. Unfortunately for the Spear of Tuval, she was right. Everything she deliberated on and the realizations she came to were all correct. She didn't miss a single beat. Rick had spent the last 5 days doing absolutely nothing. He sat there on the battlefield by himself and just waited. He didn't eat, he didn't drink, he didn't sleep, he didn't talk. His thoughts were empty, and all that remained was focus. He was like a sleeping dragon, just waiting patiently for the wrong person to climb his mountain. During this time, his body had more than consolidated its strength. It now wholly expressed it. Valora was correct in her assessment that Rick did indeed finish his evolution early. And while she was still trying to figure out how and why that happened beyond her theories, it didn't change the fact that it was an early evolution. That meant his body had to bear the cost of such a thing. When he first appeared on the battlefield, Rick couldn't tell at that moment, but he indeed wasn't at full strength. Even without having the regular activity of consolidating his strength after a recent evolution, his body was still bouncing back from the rigorous activities he had put himself through to reach this point. The fact that he had somehow accelerated his evolution wasn't something you recovered from overnight. Now, after 5 nights, that would paint a different picture, especially when the person in question did absolutely nothing for that entire time. Needless to say, it was the first time in a long time that Rick did absolutely nothing, and his new and improved body needed it. During this time, none of the goblins had approached him. All of them took his words to heart, resting and receiving medical attention. Even their usual scouts had pulled back their scope of influence just enough that they could rotate more of their members. Rick had given an order, and they would see it followed, rest and get medical attention. The king clearly wasn't in any mood to negotiate his instructions. Now, while no goblin approached Rick, there was a group of goblins who were a bit closer than the others. Commander Migra had gathered all members of the Royal Guard and sought to bring them before Rick, only to realize that he was not in any mood to meet her. The goblins and the chiefs who had exited the council told her of his order to rest and get medical attention. So she allowed the Royal Guard to rest, which included herself, but despite that, she made sure that they were in direct view of Rick. When he moved, they would move. For now they would rest, and it was indeed a much-needed rest, although both Rick and Migra feared the worst when the other royal guards didn't immediately come to see Rick. She quickly learned that it was because they were holding down one of the fronts almost entirely by themselves. It was, of course, part of their training to do just that, but that was with Rick and Migra taking the brunt of the battles in front of them. Maybe, just maybe, the royal guards would have all lost their lives defending the front almost entirely by themselves, if not for one thing happening. Loruk had evolved. He was already in the 5th tier, and all of the fighting he had done on the front had finally paid dividends. He fought harder, longer, and far more desperately than any other member of the Royal Guard. It wasn't like the others weren't trying. No, they were also giving it their all, but Loruk had a level of desperation that couldn't be explained. For him, this went back to when he was forced to run with his future king on his back while the rest of his comrades sacrificed their lives just so that he could escape. The memory of that pained him to no end. It kept him up at night, and it forced itself into almost all of his thoughts. The memory of his legs, and how he somehow reached the point where he couldn't feel them any longer, yet they still kept moving out of sheer will and drive to get his king to safety. While others died in their place, that wasn't a memory he wanted to relive. So with the situation being what it was, that same drive and will he showcased on that day, quite some time ago, had once again resurfaced in full. He fought and he fought, he killed and he did everything in his power to make sure even one more goblin would live to see another day, as long as he was alive. It was with that dedication and desperation that he managed to climb to the 6th tier, and it was that boost that allowed the Royal Guards a bit more breathing room as they fought valiantly to defend the front they held. As fate would have it, Rick's Royal Guard was here, and they were far more menacing now than when he had left them. On the 6th day, when a reorganized force of humans and demi-humans made their approach toward Rick, the Royal Guard stood because so did Rick. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't look bothered. He simply sensed the approach of the enemy and took his time getting to his feet. He even had time to pat the dirt off his person. After that, he simply stood there watching, a blank expression on his face, as the members of the GES rapidly approached. Their formations were a bit different now. Instead of being spread around like they had been in all the previous battles, ready to pin the goblins in and slowly whittle their numbers down line by line, they looked more like an arrow now. All of their remaining Tier 7s were at the front in the shape of a wedge, with the spear of Tuval at its point, and everyone else fell in behind them. That was how they decided to enter the field. And in a long list of unfortunate events for the GES, Rick would have it no other way. 216, a stamp on it. Book 4. Rick looked toward the approaching wedge of enemies barreling in his direction with nothing but murder on their minds, his face bearing almost a plastic expression. There was no excitement here, no happiness at being able to fight his enemies, just a sense of duty and anger still unfulfilled. By now, the other goblins had long since noticed the approaching enemies, and they had gathered behind the royal goblins, the chiefs, and the entire army included. While the Royal Guard did not command or rule over any goblin, they were respected almost as if they did, for they were the goblins responsible for guarding their king. So, when all the other goblins, chiefs included, saw that even the members of the Royal Guard were not hurriedly running after their king to join him in battle, they too stood still. There would be no greater desire among them than the desire of the Royal Guard to join their king in battle. All of them together watched as Rick started off at a slow trot that could barely be classified as a jog. Eventually, it reached the level of a jog, and before long he picked up speed until he was nearly sprinting, but not quite at full strength. The humans and demi-humans were on one side, the long goblin line on the other. All of the goblins didn't even realize that they were holding their breath as they gripped their weapons, clenched their fists, and watched with rapt attention as their king charged forward toward the enemy. No words of motivation came out of his mouth, no cries of vengeance, just a silent, determined run. Rick then extended his arms, and a swath of green flames materialized in his palms, flames that continued to grow in intensity as Rick neared. The approaching enemies saw him, and before long, orders for long-range attacks began being passed down. Various arrows and mana projectiles were shot toward Rick, though none of them hit, and anything that managed to get close was dodged or blocked by the wrathful flames. The flames continued to gather, and by now a long trail of green fire was following behind Rick. As he neared ever closer to the encroaching enemies, he pointed his hands forward and imbued more mana than he ever had before into his palms, then willed it forward. Of course, his mana responded. Green flame shot out like a dense stream from a hose and sprayed into the path of the approaching enemies, blowing forward like smoke from the chimney of a factory. The spear of Tuval gritted her teeth and poured forth her own well of mana, commanding the same of all her Tier 7 companions. Although their efforts were valiant and their skills vast, they were no match for the vengeance of the wrathful flames of the Goblin King, flames that were wrathful in nature and only empowered by the wrath their wielder felt. While the Tier 7s of the GES could mostly protect themselves, the same could not be said for those behind them. And with the formation they had chosen, the flames did not need to be spread very wide, just pushed forward as far as Rick's mana could carry. With his current stats, that was a significant margin. Though the flames burned furiously, they weren't enough to quench the anger Rick felt. No, that would require physical force. As the wall of fire blocked out the view of the one pushing it forward, the enemies missed the moment when Rick left his feet and were a little late to react to his presence in the air. Kaldrez. Whatever it was, every single one of them heard the word that none of them could understand leave the lips of the Goblin King. Of course, only those who survived would remember it. Power that seemed to come from the heavens above gathered in front of Rick and roared out with reckless abandon as he brought all that power down into the ranks of the enemy. Blood, dirt, gore, and whatever else had the unfortunate fate of being near the impact of that attack flew everywhere as the devastation Rick unleashed settled into existence. Before streams of survivors could descend upon him, Rick roared out one single word. Come. Right then and there, the goblins knew that they were being called by their king. They descended upon the humans and demi-humans like a sweeping tide, washing away debris in the ocean. There was little resistance, not when Rick was wreaking havoc and destruction across the battlefield. Even those like the spear of Tuval could not stem the tide crashing against her. She fought hard, and her strength was on full display. Every ability, every attack, everything she had was brought forward, nothing held back. Yet it wasn't enough. No matter what tier Rick had reached, he would always be at minimum a small step above his equals. That step had eventually grown into a chasm with each tier he climbed. There was no way someone on the same level as Rick would be able to match him under normal circumstances, and that rule only became more and more cemented in reality the higher among the tiers he reached. It was even more extravagant here at the 7th tier. They simply did not compare to Rick, the Goblin King. The battle continued. Humans and demi-humans continued to die in droves. Rick was like a phantom, moving from one part of the battle to another. Eventually, the spear of Tuval grew tired of it and took another Knight Commander of Verdun to help hold him back. They were successful. They managed to stop his relentless pursuit of their companions. But that was it. They were not able to kill him. Meanwhile, Rick's chiefs were finally free to fight with their own versions of reckless abandon. Not quite as loose as Rick, but no longer constrained or forced to fight a certain way. Now they could truly go on the attack to show not their enemies, but their king, why they were worthy of being his chiefs. Watching the situation unfold, Rick finally decided it was time to put a stamp on everything that was happening here. If the skill he had activated earlier would forever be remembered by the humans and demi-humans present on the battlefield, then the next skill he uttered would echo in the mind of the Spear of Tuval for years to come. Ruknar, 217, The Mighty King, Book 4. Power flowed into Rick's body like a river ending in a waterfall. It started as a little trickle that turned into a roaring torrent of power throughout his body. In fact, Valora, although she would not choose this time to mention it, thought that the power he was gaining right now might have been more than enough to surpass his base level in the 6th tier by itself. To put that into words, it was to say that the power just from activating Ruknar was stronger than Tier 6 Rick. To anyone deemed an enemy by Rick, that was a threatening fact. But of course, this came at a cost, one that Rick wasn't aware of yet. Though even if he did know about this cost, he wouldn't have cared, at least not right now, not with how strong and invigorated he felt at this point in time. Before the two Tier 7's knights could react, Rick vanished from his location and reappeared in front of the spear of Tuval. A fist barreled toward her head, which she slapped away with her spear. All that did was move Rick's arm out of the way, and he was once again sending an attack toward her head. But the old woman wouldn't be defeated so easily. She let out a mighty roar before activating one of her skills. Barelius. Mana instantly traveled through her feet into the ground, and then the blackened soil and stone of the dark lands of Mir rose up in gigantic spikes around her. Perhaps a lesser man would have been impaled right then and there, but Rick reacted quickly, jumping out of the way, immediately repositioning himself and preparing for another strike. Only the Verdun Knight Commander wasn't sitting idly by. He raised his sword and unleashed a skill of his own, which manifested as an arc of blue mana aiming directly for Rick's head. It whizzed through the air with sickening speed, with every intention of severing Rick's head from his body. But once again, Rick's reaction time proved too good for his enemies. He ducked out of the way, and in that same motion bent his knees, leaned forward, and pushed off in the direction of the Knight Commander, who wasn't nearly quick enough and failed to properly set up a guard in time. By the time Rick got there, it was too late for the man to react. And the Goblin King never hesitated in his actions. Rick let out a mighty roar as a fist covered in green flames shot toward the Knight Commander's chest. Not even his powerful armor or the strength of his body could do much to stop the fist of the Goblin King. A gaping hole was left by the time Rick pulled his fist out of his body. He once again turned his attention back to the spear of Tuval. She gritted her teeth, and while barreling towards Rick, at the same time she also began to coil and churn mana, not just in her body, but this time in her spear. Rick met her advance with a charge of his own, more and more green flames continuously gathering around his limbs as the power flowed throughout his body. He felt unstoppable, and that began a powerful exchange between him and the spear of Tuval. Back and forth they went, skills and mana flying all over the place as they clashed, trees turning into shards in their wake, the ground being filled with craters at every step they took. If you were too weak and happened to stand too close, your body would simply be no more from just the offshoot effects of such a battle. If there was time to stand and watch, there would have been spectators all around them. But all good things had to come to an end eventually, and that included this battle between the King of Goblins and the woman who held the military of Tuval on her shoulders and the citizens of her nation on her back. It was the type of battle that stories were written about in all forms available, from traveling bards in alleyway bars to the pens of authors and playwrights around the continent. People would have flocked to hear about this battle and everything that surrounded it. Though they would unfortunately never get the ending such a battle deserved, because reality doesn't always conform to fantasy. The spear of Tuval disengaged from Rick after one exchange and took that as a chance to finally pay attention to the state of the battlefield. What she saw left her shaken and filled with forceful resignation. While she fought with everything she had to keep the Goblin King from running rampant across the battlefield, the goblins didn't waste any time in decimating the rest of her force. She had no choice but to once again call for a full retreat in the face of the inevitable. If she were to continue fighting here, not only would they all die, but even worse, the mission of killing the Goblin King would remain incomplete. Their deaths would serve no purpose, the worst type of death for a warrior. If there had been even a small chance of them succeeding in completing the mission, she would have pressed on. But the Goblin King's prowess was beyond her understanding of all she thought possible. He was a newly evolved Tier 7, and he had already been rather strong during their first meeting, so she made sure to overestimate how much stronger he would become over the last couple of days. But to think she would still fall short in her estimations was something she had not expected. Perhaps when he first arrived at this battle and the fight began, he was within the limits of her estimates. But then he uttered a word, one that wasn't translated for her to understand, and there was no need for her to receive a definition of what it meant. The result spoke for itself. It didn't make sense. How could a skill grant someone so much power? Those were the thoughts of the spear of Tuval as she conducted a fighting retreat with all the forces she had left. Of all the Tier 7s that entered the dark lands of Mir with her, she could only see 3 more retreating alongside her. The man from North Beleriand, the lone remaining knight commander of Verdun, and the elven archer. That was it. To make matters worse, it wasn't even worth mentioning how few of their troops had survived and retreated alongside them. It was an utter defeat at the hands of the goblins, one they would have to live with forever, something they would have the opportunity to do only because Rick didn't give the order to pursue and kill them all. The goblins were riding high after winning such a massive battle, but beneath that veil of victory, everything wasn't sunshine and rainbows. While no other chiefs lost their lives, the same couldn't be said for the lower-tiered goblins on the battlefield. The number of deaths had lessened significantly, but not been eliminated. Rick knew that the chances of that paltry force returning soon were unlikely. So he decided that it was time for his people to rest. There would undoubtedly be more problems in the future, but for now they had lost enough, and it was time to rest for a significant period. He would handle things from here. 218, the King of Verdun. The situation was strange. A war was fought, yet it wasn't a war of conquest. It was a war for the death of one goblin. One side did not lose any land, and the other did not gain any land. All that happened was that the man they sought to kill remained alive. While it wasn't total annihilation for the side of the killers, they reached the point where they were no longer capable of taking the life of even one goblin. So, they had to return to their own lands. The demi-humans who were still alive had the longest journey as they traveled back to demi-human territory. The spear of Tuval took what remained of her people and made her own journey home. The riders of North Beleriand rode in silence to their northeastern homes. All over the continent, troops of all different sizes and origins from multiple powers were returning home, defeated and with far fewer than they had left with. In the weeks that followed, more and more forces, nations and groups heard about what had happened in the dark lands of Mir. While most of the populace weren't given the finer details, everyone learned 2 major facts. First, troops from all over the continent had gone north to kill the King of Goblins. Second, those same forces returned with no word of the so-called king's death. Rumors spread quickly. Some said there was no King of Goblins and that the entire ordeal was simply another minor continental war that ended without a winner. Others claimed the armies had gone to defeat some greater evil. As people tend to do, they made up whatever explanations suited them. But those in the know, families, nobles, and leaders of the various nations, knew the truth. There was indeed a Goblin King, and not only that, but he was also alive. Worse, he was far stronger than anyone had imagined. That meant the situation was beyond the worst-case scenario. The reaction to this news differed greatly across the nations that had participated in the Goblin Eradication Summit. Some wanted to immediately assemble a larger army and march back north while the goblins were still weakened. Others wanted to seal off the dark lands of Mir again, just as their ancestors had done in the past during a similar crisis. None of them had participated in that ancient sealing, but the history remained within their kingdoms. However, one king in particular had a different mindset, one of action. The King of Verdun was furious when he learned of the failure, not of the entire army, but of the knights of his own kingdom. How dare they be embarrassed by goblins, not once but twice? This was unacceptable in his eyes. Instead of conforming to the unwritten rules of engagement on the continent, where Tier 8 beings of a kingdom did not leave their borders without significant reason, the man vanished from his dwelling. His power boomed across the entirety of Verdun, and everyone of significance outside the nation could feel it. Someone in the direction of Verdun was on the move, and it was someone strong. Their power announced their presence before words could ever do so. Before anyone could act on the King of Verdun's sudden movements, the man rose into the sky and took off with a thunderous boom toward the dark lands of Mir. And unlike the long journeys of other armies from across the continent, it would not take the King of Verdun days, weeks, or months to reach his destination. Instead, less than an hour passed before the King of Verdun reached the borders of the dark lands of Mir. His power was on full display. Every creature within the dark lands of Mir stirred as they felt a presence weigh down upon them from above. This was no ordinary weight, nor was it something the King of Verdun intentionally did. Normally, he restrained himself, keeping his power suppressed, but this time he did no such thing and allowed his passive abilities to flow freely. This confrontation took place roughly a day after the surviving Knights of Verdun had returned to their kingdom. During that time, the king had long been aware of their return, waiting patiently in Verdun for their report. The moment he received it, he took off toward the dark lands of Mir. But he made it only to the border. He did not dare move a single step closer. Down below, waiting on the ground, was a small creature. It was pitch black in color, darker than anything else in the lands of Mir. Its eyes continuously shifted between the colors, yellow, white, blue, and red, without pause, each lasting only a few seconds before changing again. Two tails flowed ominously in the air as it sat calmly on the ground. Apart from these few oddities, it looked like a common house cat. Yet despite its appearance, the mighty Tier 8 King of Verdun, who floated with such power and authority in his posture, did not dare treat the creature before him like a common cat. Instead, he slowly lowered himself to the ground, eventually landing before the creature and bowing his head. "Greetings, Mir. To what do I owe the pleasure?" A voice that sounded like that of a small child, only with a hint of distortion, could then be heard. I don't really want to talk to you. Go away and don't come back." The cat said this while licking its paw, as if its words weren't a question but a statement of fact. Of course, the King of Verdun did not react in anger. He only responded calmly. "I'm afraid I cannot do that, Mir. I have business here, and I will see it done." At those words, Mir paused the licking of its paw, then it calmly lowered said paw to the ground before finally looking up at the King of Verdun. Its eyes, which had been continuously shifting between colors, finally settled on one, red. The second that happened, pressure descended upon the King of Verdun. His knees were slammed into the ground with such force that the earth for miles around shook. The cliff face that led to the Goblin clans threatened to break apart. Then Mir's voice could be heard again. "I said to go away and not come back." 219. Too Weak, Book 4. To understand just how Mir came to be waiting at the border for the King of Verdun to arrive, one would have to go back to just after the Goblins had returned to their clans. This had only happened after scouts had gone to verify that their enemies did not retreat into a camp, but had altogether left and returned to wherever it was that they came from. Only then was their own camp disbanded. Even with the loss of so many of their people, it would have still been a great cause for celebration, seeing that not only had their king returned to them, but he had also been the primary force for driving back the enemies that sought to kill him. But that very king promptly fell unconscious the second Ruknar wore off. Instead of only being weakened for some time, Rick's body had to completely shut itself down to focus on recovery. Even Valora, who would usually be able to stay awake during these moments, was left in the dark as well. This was the cost he had to pay for more power. Some would argue that this was a paltry cost compared to what was given, but others might counter and say that being forced into a state of uselessness was completely unacceptable. Regardless of which side of the fence people, or in this case goblins, landed on, this was now Rick's reality. He could tap into the deep well of power that was Ruknar, but he would have to know that it came with being rendered unconscious. For one whole day, in fact. Of course, when he lost consciousness, he was immediately collected by members of the Royal Guard and transported back to his personal abode, where a constant guard was in place and no one was allowed to approach. Yet despite that, a day later, when Rick awoke, there was something else in his room. In fact, not only was something else in the room with him, but it was also sitting directly on his chest. "Ugh, my head. What's that weight on my chest? Valora, I am here. Are you seeing this too, or am I hallucinating?" "I see it. What is it?" "A creature covered in darkness that seems to be constantly shifting between multiple forms." Oh, I also cannot scan it, by the way, so there is that. What do you mean you cannot scan it? Are you getting question marks? Number, I quite literally cannot scan it. There is something like a barrier around it, and any attempt to scan it is rebuffed. Alright, so I have a creature sitting on my chest while it constantly shifts between forms, and there is a chance it is far stronger than myself, since it is able to shrug off all your attempts to scan it. Does that sound accurate? Yes, that sounds accurate. Rick, whose head was only raised slightly, lowered it back down, closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let out a sigh. Seeing as how he had just spent the last few weeks fighting Tier 7 beasts, going toe-to-toe with humans, stressing over the repercussions of the war, and dealing with many other things that had settled in his mind since Jabba first gave him the role of chief so long ago, Rick was a far more patient goblin now. The beast resting on his chest was likely above the 7th tier, and if that assumption was correct, then Rick knew that if the beast wanted him dead, it had every opportunity to do so right now, much less while he was unconscious. As long as there was no immediate threat to his life, or more importantly his goblins, there was no reason to raise alarms and prepare to sacrifice himself in any last-ditch, tear-jerking scene. Or at least that's what Rick thought. After taking a second to relax his mind and let the haze from waking up dissipate, he opened his eyes again and looked at the creature on his chest. Coincidentally, the creature had just transformed into something that loosely resembled a cat. A cat? The creature, of course Mir, seemed to perk up at the sound of Rick's absent-minded comment. What is a cat? Rick paused for a moment as a voice, neither clearly male nor female but clouded in distortion, asked him a question. Be careful, Rick. I know. Well, a cat is a feline creature that is typically a common pet. For the most part, it is not too big and is covered in fur. Rick then spent the next few minutes describing to Mir what a cat was, and as he did so, something amazing happened. Mir's features, which were already in the process of changing, slowly began to pause in their transformation and instead started to look more and more like a cat. It did not replicate Rick's description exactly, but for all intents and purposes, Mir now resembled a cat, one with two tails, color-changing eyes, and a sort of darkness that absorbed some of the light near it. Ah, this form is interesting. You did a good thing. At this point, Rick decided to take the situation in stride and not worry too much, and this, of course, lasted only a few seconds because of Mir's next comment. My name is Mir. What is yours? Did it just say its name was Mir, like the dark lands of Mir? I believe that is precisely what it said, and if what it says is true, then this is not an ordinary being in front of us, Rick. I know, or at least I think I know. It's kind of hard to wrap my mind around meeting the being that an entire place like the dark lands of Mir is named after. Don't keep it waiting. You're right. My name is Rick. It is nice to meet you, Mir. Rick? I find you interesting. Get stronger so that we may fight forever. You are too weak right now. 220, State of the Clans, Book 4. Once again, you're hearing this too, correct? I am. And once again, Rick, be careful. Well, I'm being as careful as can be, but I don't think there's a rule book for how to handle this type of situation. Then just continue having a regular conversation. It seems to be all right with that. Well, you're not wrong, and it's not like I could do anything to stop it if it wanted to cause problems. Anyway, let's continue. I'd love to fight with you. Perhaps I could learn a thing or two from you. How strong do I need to get? Much stronger. Don't worry, I will help. How will you help? I've been helping you already. Just keep fighting the monsters I send, but you are not allowed to leave Mir until you fight me when you are stronger. As Mir said those words, its eyes, which were continuously flicking between colors, settled on red for the briefest of moments before returning to their usual shifting. This caused Rick to tense ever so slightly as he considered the implications of Mir's words. I can't leave until I'm strong enough to fight this creature. Even at my earliest estimations, it'll take me years before I reach a level where I could fight it. He let out a sigh. Then so be it, especially if it will help me get there. But that's just me. I wonder how it feels about my people. All right, I promise to stay here until I am strong enough to fight you, but what about my people? The rest of my goblins, are they allowed to leave? Don't care. Thank you, I understand. And with that, the beast disappeared from Rick's chest and went off to who knows where. Rick let out a sigh as the pressure of having someone who could decimate not only him but every single goblin who dwelled in the dark lands of Mir sat on his chest. No matter how calm or stoic he might be, that wasn't the sort of pressure one could just shrug off. In fact, there would be nothing Rick could do to remove that weight from his mind. It was natural, something he wouldn't come to understand until far later. All right. Now that that's over, I need to have a meeting with what remains of my chiefs and plan out what we'll be doing in the future. Before that, I think you should take a look at your status. I believe I see what the other price you had to pay for additional power and the faster evolution was. Rick took a look at his status, and as he gazed upon the sight that Valora wanted him to see, his expression slowly became solemn. 0? Why does the number next to essence say 0? I should have killed who knows how many humans and demi-humans, and at least 2 of which were tier 7. It should not say 0. I believe that is your price to pay, and if I am understanding it correctly, this will likely last a while. This ban on your ability to gather essence may not be permanent, but it seems to be the case for now. Rick let out another sigh. Fine then, doesn't mean I need to let it stress me out. I can't get any stronger than I am right now, and that's all right. It's probably best I focus on making sure my people are stronger anyway. The more of us that can fight and handle ourselves in this type of battle, the better off we'll be. After making up his mind, Rick got up and walked outside. He had expected someone to be standing guard at his door, but there was no one there. A few moments later, when he stepped outside in full, he saw his entire contingent of royal guards surrounding his home as if their lives depended on it. It was then that he remembered not only had he been unconscious, but he had no idea how long he had been out. Thankfully, Commander Migra was right outside the front door when he walked out. "What's the situation, Migra? Have we been attacked again, and how long have I been out?" "Currently, we are facing no attacks apart from the usual skirmishes at the fronts, and you have only been resting for a day, my king." "Ah, that's good then. Send word to all the chiefs. If they are able, I need to meet with them. If they are unable, do not force them to come. Just send a representative with the relevant information on the state of their clan and themselves. Also, make sure the royal guard gets to rest." Of course, since it was Rick who gave the order, there was no doubt that every single chief would find the time to report to their king, and they did. The 12 of them who could attend gathered. Chiefess Hugala was still unconscious. She was alive and being tended to, but still had not awakened. There was no word on when she might. This weighed heavily on Rick's heart, but he had to push on. They all did. The meeting convened between Rick and his chiefs lasted for hours. Each one that was present went over the situation within their clan, the number of goblins who had died, those who were gravely injured and could no longer contribute to fighting, and everything else they were dealing with. Of course, there was no chief to represent the central clan, but all 14 clans had great relations with one another, and the state of that clan wasn't abandoned. A new chief would take the place of the old one, as it had always been done. In the meantime, the other chiefs helped to look after them. Once the reports were gathered and the numbers were tallied, the situation appeared far more somber once it was read aloud. When Rick first arrived, he had been told there were roughly 21,000 goblins dwelling in the dark lands of Mir. That number was nearly halved. As of now, it was reported that roughly 8,000 goblins had lost their lives in the war. That was not a small number, not by a long shot, and it would take the goblins a significant amount of time to recover mentally and emotionally from such a loss. To make up those numbers again would take time they might not have, time during which Rick might not be getting stronger.